We'll start recording here now. Like Nick said, my name is Andrew Paris, and I'm joined today from Inclusion Incorporated. We're going to talk about what is the future of IDE and sailing. We're going to talk about what is the business case, what are some of the things that we see, and some of the different ways that we can start to think about this as we go into the series of future presentations. Just before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people, where I'm thankful to live, work, and play. As privileged advocates and agents of change, we need to recognize that we all have the responsibility to work towards truth and reconciliation and remain open to suggestions and consultations, especially with local Indigenous communities, on how we can repair harm and restore balance. But here's the thing really quick about land acknowledgements. These are just merely words on the screen. I'm currently reading a book called Unreconciled right now by Ojibwe author Jesse Wente. And one of the things that he speaks about often in the book is how we as Canadians struggle with the truth of our history with Indigenous communities, let alone the reconciliation piece. Every time read the land acknowledgement, I like to challenge folks, how can we turn those into action? So my challenge to you today is, as you reflect on this presentation, to take a look at the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action 87 to 91 that are specifically related to sport, and ask how many of them can you implement within your club or facility. Just a little bit about me. My pronouns are he, him, his, and il pour nos amis qui parlent en français. Speaking of those speakers, les personnes qui parlent en français, mon français, c'est comme si, comme ça, ce n'est pas très bon, mais j'essaie. Je peux répondre des questions en français. Vous pouvez le mettre dans le chat et je vais essayer mon mieux pour les répondre. I am a non-disabled, cisgendered Black man. My role at Inclusion Incorporated is the digital media and inclusion specialist, and I have the privilege of being a parent to Elijah, Kendra, and Hamilton the dog, who, because it's in the early evening here on the East Coast, is laying down semi-sleeping, so there shouldn't be, not any wood, any barks. I'm a settler here in Mi'kma'ki, commonly known today as Nova Scotia. I've spent the last 17 years or so working with various community, provincial, and national sport organizations. So sport is a bit of my forte, if you will. And when I'm not working with the team in Inclusion Incorporated and I'm getting to hang out with Nick, I am the president and founder of the Black Rock Initiative, because curling is my background. So what we do is we create opportunities for BIPOC youth to experience the sport of curling while working with curling clubs and facilities to provide them with tools and resources on how to be more welcoming to their facility, to their entire community, excuse me. As we go through this, one of the things that I hope that you have as a mindset is this quote that's here on the screen, which is do the best you can until you know better. And then once you know better, do better. The reality is we can't do better until we know, and knowledge is power. So as we know better, whether it's we're going through these presentations today and then in over the next few weeks, I encourage you to, as we take that knowledge and put that into move that forward, that we begin to start to do better. So what are we talking about this evening? I've divided this presentation up into 3 different sections. The first thing that we're going to talk about is framing the business case for inclusion work. We're going to talk about why this work needs to be undertaken and frame a bit of the business case behind it. We're also going to talk about systemic challenges that diverse populations face when it comes to being included. I'm going to show you some slides that show our changing demographics of our country and how does this affect, what does it mean for the future of sport? And how does this show up in terms of systemic barriers? And then lastly, we're going to start to dive into how can we begin to reimagine what sailing looks like. Some of the things to think about as we go to work to be more inclusive. So with that said, let's dive into why does this work need to be undertaken. Now, the quote that's there on the screen, admittedly, it's business focused, but I like it for a number of different reasons. This quote comes directly from a workplace study in 2020, but it focuses on the need to feel included, to feel part of a team, to feel that sense of belonging. We're going to touch on belonging in a little bit, but we must never forget that the reason why we participate in sport doesn't solely begin with wins or losses. It begins by that feeling, sense of belonging. And at the end of the day, that's what we all crave as human beings, regardless of where we come from, regardless of our backgrounds and lived experience. We all crave that sense of belonging. And if we can generally create that sense of belonging for those who've historically been othered, they're almost likely to stay, participate, and flourish within sport. Moving on, I like this quote from Christine Hugh, who talks about the minority is the majority. Because we have a tendency to think about those from historically underrepresented communities as less than, or only a small segment of the population. But when we truly dive into the numbers, which we're going to do a little bit here tonight, the minority is the majority. And that's why, other than it being the right thing to do, which we're going to hop into in future sessions, it makes great business sense to begin to think about how can I make my club, how can I make my facility more inclusive? A few of the things that we need to think about as we look around is the reality is that roughly only 20% of the population identifies as white or Caucasian. And because of colonialism, so the policy practice requiring full or partial political control over another country and then occupying it with settlers, which we're going to get into colonialism in another presentation. But in Canada's case, when we talk about colonialism, it consisted of those from European descent coming here to this country. White or being white is considered the default or normal way of being. And what happens is over time, this means that the systems and structures that we build, create, and live in, such as sport, for example, consist of a social construct around whiteness itself. Now, let me be clear, because I was thinking about this a little bit earlier as we were finalizing this presentation. I don't want this to be understood as I believe all white people are bad or racist, et cetera, because it's not what this is about. What I want to do, though, is we want to start to reframe. We want to start to do some unlearn, because when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, at its core, there's some unlearning there. So what we want to do is we want to reframe the way that we think about others who don't look like us, or those who come from other backgrounds, or those that we've considered to be previously considered to be the minority. Because in society, we have a tendency or bias to look at whether it's racialized folks, newcomers to Canada, Indigenous folks, those who speak French in certain parts of the country, as less than, when in reality, they're not less than or more. They're simply different. They come from different backgrounds. So let's dive into this further. Let's talk about a bit of the business case around inclusion. So there's a few things that I have there in terms of benefits of being more inclusive. The first one is expanded market opportunities. So by creating programming that meets the needs of others, you appeal to a broader range of participants and can tap into market segments or communities that were previously underserved or overlooked. This can lead to things like increased registration revenue and even sponsorships from different areas of the community that perhaps you haven't tapped into before, which then actually ties in perfectly with enhanced brand reputation. So when we talk about enhanced brand reputation, we're talking about organizations that demonstrate commitment to equity inclusion in sports. They can enhance their brand, basically how you look within the community, and attract positive attention from local media, for example, sponsors who want to have their company's organization tied in with a sailing club, perhaps such as yours, that really wants to do better, and the larger communities that we serve. What this can also do, this positive attention that you receive, can also lead to building more trust over time, which really helps with creating that sense of belonging and growing those numbers overall as well. The next part is around improved talent recruitment and retention. Simply put, if we prioritize equity and inclusion, we're more likely to retain more members in general because your members will feel that sense of belonging and have supports in place where they can go if they ever feel that's not the case. Additionally, we know that there are talented athletes outside of the markets that we traditionally serve within sailing. Therefore, the more inclusive we are, the more we can attract athletes and participants from underrepresented communities, and potentially that can lead to what we call the leaky talent pipeline, where we can add individuals from underrepresented communities, perhaps to more of our competitive teams. And then that includes a wide variety of cultures and backgrounds, and then we can all benefit over time. Like we talked about earlier, there's the increased membership and participant pool. As populations of historically underrepresented communities increase, which we're going to get into some of those numbers in a little bit, the pool of folks we can attract to the sport doesn't decrease because we've already proactively taken the time to intentionally be more equitable and inclusive, which of course ties into long-term sustainability. That's also there on the screen, the bottom row. Another benefit of being more inclusive, when we look at this from a business case, is risk mitigation. So by promoting equity and inclusion in sports, can help mitigate risk associated with discrimination, harassment, and legal challenges. By proactively addressing issues related to inequity and discrimination, organizations can avoid negative publicity and damage to their reputation. Just 1 second here, just gonna move some things around, make sure we've gotten some folks in from the waiting room. And then last but not least, by being more equitable and inclusive, we can access other funding and other grants. So governments and public agencies, when we think of Kidsport, we think of Jumpstart, think of a wide number of organizations, provide funding and grants to support initiatives that promote equity, diversity, and inclusion in sports. For example, I know here in Nova Scotia, each of the provincial sport organizations have access to funds specifically around equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that can benefit the bottom line. And we know that similar programs exist in other parts of the country as well. So by aligning your club's efforts with government priorities and objectives, your organization can potentially access additional resources and financial support, which then in turn can expand programs and expand reach. One of the things that we're going to do right now is we're going to use a program called Mentimeter. We're going to use it a couple of times. So first time, maybe we can do a little work through with this. But I want to take a couple minutes and have you list any other business case reasons that you can think of. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a moment. I'm going to open up Mentimeter here. Present that. Fantastic. In the chat, what we're going to do, as soon as I find the chat here, my goodness, my screen's acting up tonight. We're going to go to menti.com. And we're going to enter in, I'm going to go right to that code here. So if you go to menti.com and enter in code 1268 7199, or click on that link that's in the chat, you're going to see this screen that pops up here in just a moment. There we go. So we see it on the screen. So the question I have for you are, what are some of the other business case reasons that you can think of for being more inclusive? So you can share them on Menti. If technology is not your friend, because it's sometimes not always my friend, feel free to drop your answers into the chat. Feel free to also come off mute and you can share your suggestion out loud too, or the other business case reasons you can think of. So we're just going to give a couple moments for that, and then we're going to move on to the next piece. Fresh ideas, new perspectives. I love that. Always bringing new perspectives is never a bad thing. Being open-minded, which improves society as a whole. Expanded viewpoints. Love these answers. Exactly. We know there's diverse athletes from other sports, and if we can bring them into our sport, that's fantastic. Grow the sport. That's what it's all about at the end of the day, right? Growing the sport. Sustainability with club and communities. Fantastic. Growth. Awesome. I love it. So that Mentimeter page is going to stay open. Again, feel free to add reasons there. You'll be able to see that if you're at the website selfmenti.com, you'll be able to see it on the screen as we go into the next question shortly. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen there for a moment, and I'm going to go back to the presentation. Fantastic. There we go. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our changing demographics. So as we see there on the screen, we have a little bit of a breakdown of who is Canada, who is in Canada. So we know the demographics of our country are changing. In addition to some of the numbers on the screen, so we see there that those who have a disability, whether it's seen or unseen, consists of 27% of our population. We know that based on the last survey, folks of color, are over a quarter of the population. And then we have a little bit of a breakdown there in the bottom right-hand corner of folks of color, from South Asian to Chinese, Black, and et cetera, et cetera. But we also know a few other things as well. We know that Statistics Canada estimates that people of color will consist of 36% of the population in just roughly another 10 years. In addition to those numbers on the screen, just over 27% of Canadians age 15 to 34 self-identified as a member of a racialized group. So as the population changes, we want to be proactive. We don't want to be reactive. We've seen time after time again in sport across the board where somebody joins who looks perhaps a bit different, and something happens, and then the media picks it up and runs with it, and it becomes this big problem. And now we're suddenly reacting to the incident that happened as we try to be inclusive. When we talk about the business case of being more inclusive, we want to be proactive and not reactive. The other thing too is we need to remember intersectionality. And let me explain. The first thing that we need to remember is when I talk about underrepresented groups, normally what happens is a big Black guy. When we talk about underrepresented groups, you normally default to race. But we know that those from the 2S LGBTQIA community typically have a lesser sport experience than those who are considered straight. We know that those who come from a rural environment oftentimes have a lesser sport experience than those who come from an urban environment. We know that those who come from a low socioeconomic background typically have a lesser sport experience than those who don't. So as we go around this wheel, whether we go left to right or right to left, doesn't really matter. But we know that those on the outside are considered part of the marginalized or underrepresented communities. So that's the first thing to remember when we talk about different underrepresented groups. But another thing to remember is that the barriers that an individual faces when it comes to participating in our sailing clubs and in sport in general varies every time we have an additional layer of marginalization that we add on. And that's intersectionality at its core. So intersectionality was a term developed by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 80s, 1989 to be specific. And when we talk about intersectionality, what it means is every time we add a layer of marginalization to an individual, the barriers that they face are different. So for example, the barriers that I may face in participating in a sporting activity as a Black man are different than a Black woman. They're also different than a Black woman who identifies as a lesbian. That would also be different as a Black woman who identifies as a lesbian who comes from a low socioeconomic environment. Basically, when we pull all that apart, what we're trying to say is that not all Black people are the same, not all Indigenous people are the same, not all the folks we have on the call are the same. I'm sure if we asked questions and had a little bit of an icebreaker, we'd quickly realize some of the differences that each of us have on this call tonight. But that's just an important thing to remember as we start to create programming, as we become a bit more inclusive. I like this slide here. So according to recent projections of the diversity of the Canadian population, and based on the scenario that we have here, the share of immigrant women and girls living in Canada is likely to increase to 22% from 2011 to 27% of the population by 2031. During the 5 years from 2011 to 2016, the female population who identified as immigrants or new Canadians grew by 14%, which is more than twice the pace of Canada's total female population, which grew by 5.6%. So again, this is nothing to be fearful of, but these are things that we need to start to think about as we become more inclusive. When we look at Indigenous folks, nearly 1.7 million identified as Indigenous, or back when the survey was written, Aboriginal back then. But in the 2016 census, Statistics Canada says a 4.9 share of the total population, and breathtaking 42.5% increase since 2016. And projections show that the Indigenous population in Canada will top 2.5 million by 2036. Well, see it. We have everybody from the waiting room. Perfect. Thank you for letting me know, Amanda. I will keep an eye on that waiting room. When we look at those who identify as with a disability, in 2022, the number of Canadians aged 15 and older, or 8 million, had at least one disability. Whether this is seen or unseen, we have to remember that those with a disability aren't always something that we can see. And on the screen there, we have a little bit of the breakdown of the population from coast to coast to coast, with some of the largest increases actually happening in places like New Brunswick and here in Nova Scotia. So that's a lot of numbers. But when we look at that, like, what does that actually mean for sport? So this is research here on the screen that just came out from the brand new Change the Game research report from Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment. Over 10,000 youth were surveyed in 2023. On the screen, you can see the reports of racism from Black, Indigenous, and other racialized youth have increased over the past 2 years. That sense of belonging that we talked about earlier is not only hard to find within sport, but is also decreasing. So we see there on the screen that from 2021 to 2023, that The percentage of youth who experience racism has increased for Black youth, Indigenous youth, and other racialized youth as well. These next couple of slides come from the 2023 Canadian Non-Binary Youth and Sport Report. So this sample set was almost 3,500 cisgender and non-binary youth from across the country. When we look at that, 1 in 2 non-binary youth in Canada have avoided joining an organized team sport because of teammates and coaches. More than 1 in 2 non-binary youth in Canada in sport have witnessed discriminating comments. And then more than 1 in 6 non-binary youth in Canada have witnessed some form of physical harassment in just simply because of their gender. And those numbers continue. 4 in 5 non-binary youth in Canada have avoided joining organized sport simply because of change room, locker room layouts. The reality is we're seeing these numbers pop up more and more in sport, and we're also seeing it in coaching as well. 36%, we see there on the screen, 36% say of coaches say their identity negatively impacts their coach and peers' perception of them as a coach. Goes even further to talk about in this Ontario coaches report, 1 in 5 coaches have heard offensive language that could be considered racist, sexist, homophobic within their club or competition. We have some more numbers there too, and we continue. My point being, when we show these numbers, it's about talking about not only is our population changing, but the instances that we're seeing are increasing. And I would argue that sport organizations in general, across the board, haven't done the greatest job doing this. So what we tend to see then are other programs that are popping up within these communities. But if we can create inclusive presentations with inclusive spaces and places within the organizations that we already have exist, the ceiling or the potential is so, so high. So when we look at barriers to participation in sport, and this comes from the Department of Canadian Heritage's Future of Sport Survey. When we look at what was identified as barriers for participation in sport for children, a lot of those top 7 answers we can tie into feelings of acceptance and belonging, and also not feeling that they've been reached out to or been spoken to or advertised to as to our sport programs. And then when we look at what folks look as the purpose of sport moving forward, the top 4 directly tie into that sense of belonging. Therefore, fostering that sense of belonging needs to be a higher priority for all of our clubs and facilities. This isn't just something that I'm saying. This is how the numbers and the data, how this all bears out. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to Mentimeter using the same code, and I'll be sure to drop it into the chat. But what trends are you observing within your organization? So let me just stop sharing my screen here for just a moment. And we're going to open up Mentimeter here again and go on to the next question. So if you still have it there, you should see that change on your screen. And like I said, I'm going to drop the Mentimeter into the chat here. I want to take a couple minutes. What trends are you observing in terms of different populations within your organization? As you're answering that question, if I know I've thrown a lot of information at you, I said to Nick earlier, it's a little bit like drinking out of a fire hose. So my email address is going to be at the end and I'm going to stick on the call a little bit at the end to answer questions. But if you have any questions now, by all means, feel free to throw them out there as we answer that Mentimeter question. Increase in new Canadians, split between those interested in changing our IDE length, 100%. The conversations that we have now about IDE versus conversations that we had pre-pandemic, so I'm thinking 2016 to 2019, and the conversations that we had post George Floyd are very different conversations. 100% agree with that. Not enough younger members, 100%, which is another reason why we need to start thinking about things differently. BIPOC participants leaving after only 1 year. Yeah, we see that across lots of sports. I come from the sport of curling. See that all the time in my particular sport. Locations, COVID. I love it. We'll leave this open for just another minute and then we'll keep it moving to the next part of the presentations. Like I said, lots of information to cover tonight. Lack of training. So I'm going to keep that Mentimeter open. Feel free to continue to add your thoughts in there. Feel free to add them into the chat. I'm going to go back here, share my screen. We'll go back to the presentation here. Fantastic. So now let's dive into some systemic barriers that we tend to see, not only in society, but in sport. So this is a quote from Emmanuel Ocho, and I really like this quote. It says, color and ethnicity are a part of what makes us, what makes people human. And to deny any of us our particular, and to deny any of us of our particularity is to deny our humanity. Earlier, we spoke about whiteness and the norm or default, and thus making other cultures less than or not equal. Oftentimes I hear, I don't see color. And while I can sometimes understand where the sentiment comes from, let's be honest. We do actually see color and we do actually see ethnicity. A big systemic barrier that we see often in sports, especially sports that lack diversity, is normalcy and complacency. And what I mean by that is we hear often, this is the way we've always done things and will continue to do things. So we operate from this place of equity rather than looking through things through an equitable lens. That's a whole lot of big words for saying, let's celebrate our differences. I'm going to go out on a limb. I like to think I know Nick pretty well, but I don't know others fairly well. But one of the things I'd like to think is that all of you, in some way, shape, or form, love the sport of sailing, or at least really like the sport of sailing. Because what other reason would you be joining me on a call on a Wednesday evening? So when we look at equity and inclusion at its core, what we're talking about is that love that you have for the sport, passing that on to others while celebrating and embracing those differences and even learning about some of those differences. Yes, it can be more complicated than that as we dive into the nitty-gritty, if you will. But that's what we're talking about when we talk about equity and inclusion at its core. Is passing on that love of the sport while celebrating differences. All right. So, like I said, my notes got ahead of me, so I apologize. Earlier, when we spoke about whiteness as being the normal default, and thus making cultures less than or not equal, when we start to, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, play into those beliefs, it can make the attitudes that go with it okay, which then makes things like microaggressions, so subtle or intentional or unintentional exclusionary jokes, groups, individuals, it suddenly makes that okay. We're going to go into microaggressions a little bit more during our next presentation when we break down equity and diversity and inclusion a little bit more. But I want you to think of microaggressions like this. So, for example, one of the things that I've heard over time myself is, oh, you're really well spoken for a Black person. Or playing the sport curling where there isn't a whole lot of diversity, I've heard, oh, you're a really good curler for a Black person. And every time one of those is said, even if it comes from a place of well intention, it creates this thing called a scratch. So we can see that the white mark here on my arm. Scratch in and of itself, okay, it's a mark. Hurts a little bit, but not real much. But over time, we have another microaggression and another microaggression and another microaggression. Those scratches over time, what ends up happening is it pierces my skin and then it becomes a real problem. Then it bleeds and creates all sorts of other problems. That's what we talk about when we talk about microaggressions. It's one intentional or unintentional subtle mark of where are you actually from, which then leads into the racial slurs that we talk about, slurs are okay, which then lead to a whole bunch of other things. This is what we call the pyramid of harm. And this is why when we look at discrimination at its core, it's really important to stop that, to prevent it, to lessen those instances of discrimination because it leads to far worse things. This video, it's 7-8 minutes long. We're only going to watch the first couple minutes because it dives into what is systemic racism and what does systemic racism look like in Canada. This is a video from the CBC. So I'm going to play this video here now.
This is sovereign Wet'suwet'en land. You are trespassing.
Canada has been really good at convincing itself and the world that the terrible things that come out of colonization somehow didn't happen here.
There's no systemic discrimination. There's no system in Quebec.
Thank God that we're different than the United States.
Their denial is part of the system of systemic racism.
It's an inaccurate history.
This country was founded on systemic discrimination.
We don't talk about the origins, where it comes from, how our whole society is based on white male superiority.
Systemic racism is the normalizing of racism.
It's not directly in your face.
Systemic racism is something that touches every corner of our country, every corner of our institutions.
Commissioner Brenda Lucki said she struggled with the term systemic racism. Later, the commissioner said it does exist in the RCMP.
We definitely have that in the RCMP, and we are not immune to it at all.
These are institutions that were built with the intention and the understanding that they were not really to service people who are not white. There are these myths that we are so radically different from the US. Both countries are founded out of stolen and colonized land. Both countries have attempted genocide on indigenous peoples. Both countries have long histories of slavery.
It's easy to point somewhere else, and it's another form of gaslighting.
In Canada, we talk a lot about, the Underground Railroad, Black people escaping slavery and coming to Canada. But we don't also talk about how that after the end of the Civil War in the US, that many of those same Black people went back to the US.
So the video goes on, but when we talk about systemic barriers, one of the things that we really need to recognize is those systems we create where there's certain norms and certain ways that are less than, that are proper ways of behaving or perhaps less than. We need to remember that over time, although we don't necessarily see overt racism in face so much anymore as we did in the 60s and 70s, the residual effects of people, the systemic barriers that those policies have created still exist today, which is why at its core, we need to make sure that we're doing what we can in sport to create systems and structures where those from underrepresented communities can take off the burden or take off that invisible backpack and be able to participate in our sport to feel that sense of belonging. This is another quote here on the screen that I really like. You are not responsible for your first thought, but are responsible for your second thought and your first action. When we talk about how do we dismantle these systemic systems, it starts with just one move. It starts with just one conversation. It can start with just one presentation. And what that does is it really affects our ROI, or what I like to refer to as our ripple of impact. And if you join us for the next few sections, you're going to hear me talk about ripple of impact a lot. Because by creating one change, by creating an inclusion policy within our clubs, that can create a ripple of impact where we suddenly have more folks join our sailing clubs and sailing groups. And over time, who knows, maybe we then identify an Olympian over time, or then maybe we find somebody who loves sailing for the rest of their life simply because we reached out and we're a little bit more inclusive. That's what I talk about when we talk about being responsible for your second thought and your first action. So how do we begin to reimagine what sailing looks like? Excuse me. I'm going to quickly define some terms here because I know we're coming to the end. But when we talk about diversity, if we look at it through this image of trees, we talk about diversity as the practice of including or involving people from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds, different genders, sexual orientations, et cetera, et cetera. But you can be unintentionally diverse. If we take a look around our virtual room tonight, like I mentioned earlier, we'd see all kinds of people from different backgrounds. But all that happened was Nick put it in ads that come join us for an IDE talk tonight. You can be unintentionally diverse. So what I'm saying by that is having an open door to your facility isn't enough. To achieve diversity, we need to achieve creating a safer space, which means when we look at diversity as a byproduct of what we're trying to achieve. Diversity is a byproduct of being inclusive, which is the effort and practices in which different groups or individuals having different backgrounds are culturally and socially accepted and welcome. Inclusion is being intentional. Then when we look at equity, equity recognizes that each person comes from different circumstances, faces different barriers, and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. Equity and equality are not the same thing. We're going to dive into that further in our next session. But when we create programs that within our clubs and facilities with an equity lens, they'll eventually be equitable. Once equality is achieved, we maintain that as best as we can through inclusive policies and practices. And if we're intentionally being inclusive, we'll see meaningful diversity on the water and within our clubs. Basically, when all these three things come together, that's what creates that sense of belonging, which is the feeling of being happy or comfortable as a particular part of a group. And like I mentioned earlier, that's what we all crave, regardless of the backgrounds we come from. So that's what we're trying to achieve. But there are opportunities. There are great programs out there. So here on the East Coast in Nova Scotia, out of Halifax and Digby, a couple of hours north of Halifax, there's the Black Youth Ice Hockey Program that's run by a friend of mine by the name of Dean Smith. In the Greater Toronto area, we have the Hijabi Balas Program, which is run by Amreen Kadwa, and I apologize if I pronounce her name incorrectly, who focuses on creating opportunities for Muslim youth in a wide variety of sports, but it started with basketball. Then we have the Lacrosse and Barriers Program that's run primarily through Alberta, but popping up throughout Canada. It's ran by a gentleman I had the pleasure of meeting a couple of years ago by the name of Scott Godfrey. It's adaptive lacrosse programming, and he's also beginning to create lacrosse programming for underrepresented communities. But through all three of those programs, there's some commonalities there that we need to take away and we need to notice. The first thing that we notice is that it acknowledges that other communities aren't the problem. So whether we're trying to attract more newcomers to our program, whether we're trying to attract more Indigenous folks, whatever that underrepresented group is, they're not a problem to be solved. The other thing that all these programs have in common is developing trust with community has been absolutely crucial. So it starts off by having a conversation, meeting community where they're at. So perhaps it's going to a First Nations community, perhaps it's working with a resettlement group, and having a conversation of what does Salem look like to your community? What is it that exists within Salem that we could change to make our sport a little bit more inclusive? And then when we have those conversations, we have to actively listen to the community and not just focus on checking the box, if you will. Because if we ask the community these questions, if we step outside our own comfort zone and ask these questions, if we don't take any of those learnings into consideration, what then happens is we're then sending the message of we were just checking the box. And then as we start to run our programs, as we start to create more inclusive environments, we look for feedback and accept that success may not happen right away, but failure isn't the end. Failure is just a learning opportunity and not an endpoint. So then we fail fast and we fail forward. In the next presentation, I'm going to give you examples of programs I've seen where, even within the BlackRock Initiative, we didn't have huge success at first. But we learned from that and we built that into something that, I mean, I'm biased, but I like to think it's pretty awesome. So based on this conversation today, and like I said, I know there's a whole lot of information coming at you, a whole lot of data coming at you. I hope you take the time to reflect on some of the conversations that were had tonight. And we're going to build these conversations as we go through future sessions. But based on this conversation we've had tonight, what's one thing you will start doing? What's one thing you will stop doing? And what's one thing you can continue to do? Just one thing, not a whole bunch of lists. So don't go home or go eat supper and write down 12, 13 different things. But just what's one thing you're going to start doing? What's one thing you're going to stop doing? And what's one thing you're going to continue to do? Because it's one thing for me to have this conversation with you tonight. It's a whole nother thing for Nick to host this series of presentations. But ultimately, change starts with you. That ripple of impact that we talked about earlier starts with you. And once we drop that pebble and start to create that ripple effect, once we start to create that change, there's no telling what lives will impact or how much better we can make our carbon facilities. But it starts with that one step. And that one step tonight is starting with specifically you. So that's all I got. Nick, I left it with 10 minutes to spare. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here in a moment and open up the floor to questions. My email address is there on the screen. It's just andrew@inclusionincorporated.com. In case you have questions that you want to ask me for the whole group and want to email me, that's totally cool. Thanks for taking the time to join us tonight. Like I said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm also going to stop recording as well so that we can ask questions in a little bit more of a safer environment. As soon as I find the button, there we go.